I am Bradley, 32 years old. Last Sunday, after 8 brutal years of sacrificing every single luxury to afford my dream home, my deadbeat brother announced to our entire family that he was moving into my house. While I was sitting there, utterly exhausted from working 80-hour weeks in the cutthroat real estate market just to keep my head above water, my parents looked at me and said, "Family sticks together during tough times, Bradley, so your brother gets your spare bedroom." They raised their champagne glasses, smiling like they had just solved world hunger, completely disregarding the fact that I owned the property, paid the mortgage, and had never been consulted about this arrangement in any way, shape, or form. They laughed and joked about how I was never home anyway, completely humiliating me in front of my own extended family who had gathered for the occasion. But there is a massive secret they did not know. While they were busy plotting behind my back to turn my hard-earned sanctuary into a free hotel for their golden child, I had already met with a lawyer, signed a stack of legally binding documents, and quietly sold the entire property to a young couple. And right now, they are the ones begging me to cancel a finalized contract, completely terrified of the reality that my brother is about to be homeless. Before I tell you exactly how this explosive family dinner went down, hit that like button if you believe that nobody has the right to steal your peace, especially your own family. And please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let us go back to where this nightmare truly started. The dining room smelled of garlic mashed potatoes, roasted rosemary, and the slow-cooked pot roast my mother only made for special occasions. It was a classic Sunday dinner at my parents' house in the Chicago suburbs, the kind of gathering that usually felt predictable and mundane. But on this particular evening, the air was thick with a strange, forced enthusiasm that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mother, Brenda, had brought out the good china, the plates with the delicate gold trim that usually only saw the light of day during Thanksgiving dinners or major holidays. My father, Richard, had chilled a bottle of expensive vintage champagne in a silver bucket resting on the mahogany sideboard. For a fleeting, foolish second when I first walked through the front door, taking off my coat and smelling the rich aroma of the roast, I actually thought they were celebrating my recent promotion at the brokerage. I had just closed a massive commercial deal and I thought just maybe this dinner was for me. I should have known better. In my family, celebrations were never about my achievements. My victories were always met with a polite nod and a quick change of subject. Grand gestures and expensive champagne were exclusively reserved for my younger brother, Nolan. Nolan walked in 25 minutes late, completely unapologetic. Instead of his usual faded graphic tee and torn jeans, he was wearing a crisp button-down shirt tucked into khakis, his hair neatly styled. He carried a cheap bottle of wine wrapped in a foil bag like it was a grand offering to a king. He did not apologize for keeping us waiting. He just dropped his keys on the entryway table and took the seat at the absolute head of the dining table, a spot usually reserved for my father. My father did not object. Instead, he practically beamed at Nolan, patting him on the shoulder. As we served ourselves, passing the heavy ceramic bowls of green beans and potatoes, the conversation felt horribly scripted. It was like watching a bad stage play where everyone knew their lines except me. My mother kept making pointed, invasive comments about my living situation. She chewed her food slowly, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes, and talked about how a big, beautiful house like mine must feel terribly lonely for a single guy. She emphasized the words extra space and wasted rooms over and over. My father chimed in right on cue, delivering heavy-handed lectures about the current economy. He spoke in these broad, sweeping platitudes about how a family needs to be a safety net, how the world is a harsh place, and how blood is thicker than water. I sat there, cutting my roast beef into perfectly square pieces, chewing slowly, and watching the three of them exchange these loaded, knowing glances. I knew something was coming. I could feel the trap closing around me. The tension in my gut was tighter than a coiled spring, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer audacity of what happened next. Nolan stood up, cleared his throat loudly to command the room's attention, and reached for the chilled bottle. The cork popped with a loud, festive crack that echoed off the dining room walls. He poured the bubbling liquid into 4 crystal flutes, handed one to me with a smirk, and raised his glass high in the air. He put on this incredibly fake, solemn expression, playing the role of the humble victim. He announced to the table that his landlord was being completely unreasonable, fabricating noise complaints, and unfairly kicking him out of his apartment. Then, his face broke into a massive, entitled grin. The mask of the victim vanished, replaced by the smug arrogance I had known my entire life. "But every cloud has a silver lining," Nolan said, his eyes locking onto mine across the table. "Mom and Dad and I have been talking for the past week. We looked at all the options and we came up with the perfect win-win solution. Starting next Saturday, I am moving into your house, Bradley. Just until I get back on my feet, of course. Mom said your home office has great natural light, so I will be taking that room." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. My parents turned their heads toward me simultaneously, their faces stretched into these huge, expectant smiles. They were waiting for me to jump up, raise my glass, and enthusiastically welcome my deadbeat brother into my sanctuary. Nolan looked so incredibly smug, taking a slow sip of his champagne, already mentally arranging his video game consoles and guitar amplifiers in my pristine home office. They had held a secret family meeting behind my back. They had discussed my property, negotiated my living space, and decided the fate of my home without ever asking me a single question. And now they were presenting it to me not as a request, but as a mandatory family obligation, weaponizing guilt and obligation over a plate of pot roast. I looked at my mother, whose smile was beginning to falter at the edges. I looked at my father, who was leaning forward, ready to shut down any argument I might have. And I looked at the brother who had never worked a hard day in his 29 years of life, who felt entirely entitled to the fruits of my grueling labor. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, sending a rush of adrenaline through my veins, but my hands, resting on the white linen tablecloth, were completely steady. I did not yell. I did not flip the table. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I simply reached down into the heavy leather briefcase resting beside my chair. I unzipped the main compartment, pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope, and placed it right on the table, right next to Nolan's champagne glass. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice devoid of any emotion, and delivered the words that shattered his entire reality into a million jagged pieces. But to understand the absolute devastation on their faces in that moment, and why I was willing to completely abandon the home I loved more than anything just to escape their suffocating grip, you need to know exactly what it cost me to buy that house in the first place. You need to understand the absolute hell I went through, scraping by on pennies, while Nolan was handed the world on a silver platter. I thought the worst was over when I finally got the keys to my house. I was so incredibly wrong. Growing up in our middle-class suburban home, the rules were glaringly simple, yet entirely divided. If I wanted something, I had to bleed for it. If Nolan wanted something, he just had to complain loud enough until my parents gave in to buy his silence. My parents always claimed they were treating us according to our individual needs. I was the capable one, the strong one, the one who did not need hand-holding or constant validation. Nolan, on the other hand, was the sensitive soul. He was fragile. He needed extra support, extra time, and, most importantly, extra money. That extra support became agonizingly clear the summer before I left for college. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the harsh fluorescent light buzzing overhead. My father sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and a cheap calculator. He did not look at me with pride. He looked at me like an accountant reviewing a liability. He explained in a very clinical, detached voice how student loans worked. He told me that a college fund was a luxury they simply could not provide, despite the fact that we lived in a 4-bedroom house and drove new cars. He looked me straight in the eye and said that building my own character through hard work and financial struggle was the best inheritance a father could possibly give a son. I swallowed my disappointment and took that harsh lesson to heart. For 4 years, I lived in a constant state of exhaustion. I took out massive loans that kept me awake at night, terrified of the interest accumulating. I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner, smelling like stale fry grease and cheap coffee during my 8 a.m. macroeconomics lectures. I flipped burgers, scrubbed industrial toilets, and eventually managed an off-campus apartment complex just to secure a miserable discount on rent. I graduated with a business degree, a mountain of suffocating debt, and a fierce, unbreakable independence that isolated me from my peers who were busy enjoying their youth. 2 years later, Nolan decided he wanted to go to the exact same university. Suddenly, by some absolute miracle, my parents found the money. They tapped into their retirement savings, completely ignored their previous philosophy about building character, and handed Nolan a full ride. He did not have to fill out a single loan application. He did not have to work a single hour. While I had been serving drunk students hash browns at 3 in the morning, Nolan spent his time joining a fraternity, going to lavish tailgates, and blowing through his generous weekly allowance on concert tickets and overpriced alcohol. 3 semesters later, the inevitable happened. He flunked out. His GPA was so abysmally low it was almost statistically impossible to achieve unless you actively tried to fail. I remember waiting for the fallout. I waited for my father to pull out the yellow legal pad and the calculator. I waited for the harsh lecture about responsibility. It never came. Did my parents cut him off? Absolutely not. My mother wept at the kitchen table, wiping her eyes with a tissue, claiming that the university system was too rigid, too demanding for a creative, free-thinking mind like Nolan's. Instead of making him get a job, they paid for him to attend a local community college, which he also dropped out of after a year because the morning commute was too stressful. Over the next decade, Nolan bounced from job to job like a pinball. He got fired from a luxury car dealership for taking a customer's sports car on an unauthorized joyride to impress a date. He quit a promising position at a tech startup because the manager had the audacity to ask him to show up at 9 in the morning. Every single failure, every single bridge he burned, was met with a financial bailout from my parents. They paid his rent for months on end when he came up short. They bought him a reliable, late-model sedan when his old car broke down, claiming he needed safe transportation for job interviews he never went to. They even paid off his crippling credit card debt twice, calling it an early inheritance to justify the sheer absurdity of their enabling. Meanwhile, I was grinding my way up in the vicious, unforgiving world of the Chicago real estate market. Real estate is not a job for the faint of heart. It is a brutal, commission-only bloodbath where you eat what you kill, and if you do not close, you do not pay rent. I started at the absolute bottom as an assistant, fetching coffee, organizing open house flyers, and taking the verbal abuse of top-tier agents. I worked 7 days a week. I skipped vacations. I missed Thanksgiving dinners with friends because I was busy showing properties to out-of-town buyers who ended up purchasing with someone else anyway. Every single commission check I earned was meticulously split into strict categories. Aggressively paying down my student debt, basic living expenses, and the holy grail, my house fund. When I finally turned 30, after years of relentless, agonizing saving, I had accumulated enough for a solid down payment. The market at the time was fiercely competitive. Properties were flying off the shelves in a matter of days, with all-cash offers frequently beating out traditional financing. But I knew the market better than anyone. I scoured listings at midnight, and eventually I found it. A stunning, century-old craftsman-style home in a highly desirable, quiet suburban neighborhood. It had original, gleaming hardwood floors, a beautiful wraparound porch perfect for summer evenings, and a massive, ancient oak tree anchoring the front yard. It was at the absolute top of my approved budget, pushing my debt-to-income ratio to the absolute limit, but it was perfect. The day I signed the closing papers and the escrow company handed me the heavy brass keys, I sat in my car in the driveway and cried. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, tears streaming down my face. I am not ashamed to admit it. Those tears held every missed party, every exhausting double shift, every moment of sheer panic over my finances when I had to choose between groceries and a utility bill. That house was my trophy. It was physical, undeniable proof that my grueling path, my lonely struggle, had been worth it. I hosted a housewarming party a month later, hoping to finally share my victory. My parents came, walking through the front door and handing me a small $50 gift card to a local hardware store. My father stood on the back patio, grilling burgers and proudly telling my new neighbors about his successful son in real estate. For a few fleeting hours, holding a cold beer and looking at my manicured lawn, I felt seen. I felt like they finally respected me as a man. Then Nolan arrived. He was 3 hours late. He did not bring a gift, not even a bottle of cheap wine. He walked through the front door, tracked mud from his boots onto my freshly polished hardwood floors, and immediately started complaining loudly about the traffic on the highway. He drank my premium, expensive whiskey without asking, cornered my professional colleagues to complain about his latest ex-girlfriend, and eventually pulled me aside into the kitchen. He looked around my pristine, beautifully decorated home with a visible sneer of jealousy. "Nice place, Bradley," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "A bit excessively big for one single guy, though. Hey, my apartment is tiny and the landlord is a jerk. I am going to throw my birthday bash here next month. You can clear out all this furniture in the living room for a DJ and a dance floor." I stared at him, utterly dumbfounded by the entitlement. I told him absolutely not. I explained, keeping my voice low and firm, that I respected my neighbors, that this was a quiet, family-oriented neighborhood, and my home was not a frat house for him to trash. Nolan threw a massive, explosive tantrum right there in my kitchen. He called me a stuck-up snob, accused me of forgetting where I came from, stormed out the front door, and slammed it so hard the windows rattled. He spent the next 2 weeks sending me unhinged, passive-aggressive text messages about how making a little bit of money had ruined my personality. My parents called me endlessly, aggressively urging me to just let him have the party to keep the peace, telling me I was being rigid and unbrotherly. I held my ground. I refused to let him disrespect my home. That was my first real boundary with my family, and it deeply enraged them. For 2 years after that, I lived in relative peace. I painted the walls, landscaped the yard, and built a quiet, stable life I loved. I thought I had finally escaped the gravitational pull of my family's toxic dysfunction. I thought the worst was behind me, but homeownership is a heavy, relentless crown, and my beloved craftsman was about to reveal its true, destructive nature, setting off a chain reaction that would force me to make the hardest, most painful decision of my entire life. The grand illusion of my perfect, stable life started crumbling to pieces on a rainy Tuesday morning. I woke up early, eager to get a head start on some property listings, walked into my kitchen to make a pot of coffee, and stepped barefoot right into a freezing puddle of water that covered half the floor. Pure, unadulterated panic shot through my chest. I grabbed every single towel I owned, frantically throwing them onto the hardwood, trying to soak up the mess while dialing the emergency number for a plumber. Hank, a grizzled old plumber who had been in the business for 40 years and had seen it all, arrived an hour later. He moved slowly, cutting a ragged hole in my freshly painted drywall beneath the sink. He shined his heavy-duty flashlight into the dark, damp cavity, went silent for a long moment, and let out a long, heavy, rattling sigh. If you own a home, you know that sigh. It is the absolute worst sound a homeowner can possibly hear. Hank stood up, wiping his wet, grimy hands on a grease-stained rag, his face grim. He explained that the main water line, which was decades old and made of outdated galvanized steel, had completely corroded from the inside out. The leak under the kitchen sink was not just a loose fitting. It was a symptom of a much larger, catastrophic systemic failure. "I have to be completely straight with you, Bradley," Hank said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a sentence. "Patching this specific pipe is a waste of your time and money. It will just burst somewhere else next week. You need a total, comprehensive repipe of the entire house, and we need to tear up the concrete foundation in the basement to get to the main line connecting to the city. You are looking at a minimum of $7,000. And that does not include fixing the drywall and the floors." $7,000. The number echoed in my head, loud and terrifying. 2 months prior, the aging HVAC system had catastrophically failed during a heat wave, costing me a brutal $4,000 to replace. Before that, It was a major electrical upgrade mandated by the city to meet current fire codes. My emergency fund, which took me years of skipping lunches and denying myself vacations to build, was completely, utterly depleted. I logged into my banking app while Hank packed up his tools. I had exactly $1,242 in my checking account. The only option to keep my house livable was to put the massive plumbing repair on a high-interest credit card. A dangerous financial trap I had sworn on my life I would never, ever fall into. To compound the nightmare, the stress at my brokerage was reaching a boiling point. I was currently representing Victor, an extremely wealthy, highly demanding tech CEO looking to purchase a sprawling commercial property for his company's new headquarters. The commission on this single deal was astronomical. It would wipe out my mounting debts instantly and secure my position at the firm. But Victor was an absolute nightmare of a client. He demanded private property tours at 6 in the morning, changed his architectural parameters daily, and routinely threatened to pull his lucrative business and go to a rival agency if I did not cater to his every insane whim. My managing broker pulled me into his glass-walled office and made it crystal clear. Lose Victor's business, and my future at the firm was in serious jeopardy. I was burning the candle at both ends, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, mainlining caffeine, and trying desperately to keep a confident, professional smile on my face while my personal financial life was violently imploding behind the scenes. I needed objective, ruthless advice. I scheduled a late-evening coffee meeting with Carmen, a close friend from my college days who had become a brilliant, no-nonsense financial advisor. We sat at a quiet, dimly lit corner table in a downtown cafe, my meticulously organized, color-coded financial spreadsheets spread out before her. Carmen looked over the numbers in silence for 10 minutes, her expression growing increasingly grim with every page she turned. She took out a red pen and highlighted the massive mortgage payments, the escalating property taxes, the exorbitant homeowners insurance, and the recent crushing avalanche of repair bills. "Bradley, I love you, and I know exactly how much this house means to your pride," Carmen said softly, putting the cap back on her pen. "But the math does not care about your feelings. The numbers do not lie. You are severely house poor. The maintenance on a century-old property is eating you alive, bite by bite. You are putting basic living expenses like groceries and gas on credit cards just to float the mortgage. If you do not radically change course right now, you are heading straight for bankruptcy, or worse, a massive foreclosure lawsuit that will destroy your credit for a decade." I felt physically sick. The coffee in my stomach turned to acid. The thought of losing my home, of putting a "for sale" sign in the front yard, felt like a colossal, humiliating failure. It meant Nolan was right about me playing out of my league. It meant all those years of saving, all the agonizing double shifts at the diner, were for nothing. "What do I do, Carmen?" I asked, my voice cracking, barely above a whisper. "I have fought so hard for this." "You sell," Carmen said firmly, leaning across the table, her eyes locked on mine. "The real estate market is scorching hot right now. Inventory is incredibly low. Property values in your specific neighborhood have skyrocketed 20% since you bought it. If you list it right now, you can pay off the mortgage, wipe out every cent of your credit card debt, and walk away with a massive pile of liquid cash. It is not a failure, Bradley. It is a strategic, intelligent retreat. Do not let your ego and your pride drag you into financial ruin. Cut your losses and secure your future." I spent the next 3 days in a state of absolute, agonizing turmoil. I walked through my empty, quiet house at night, tracing my fingers over the custom built-in bookshelves I loved so much, listening to the rain hit the roof. But the anxiety was crushing me. Every time a floorboard creaked, I wondered how much it would cost to fix. Every time I turned on a faucet, I prayed the pipes would hold. Finally, the cold, hard pragmatism that had kept me alive and functioning all these years kicked in. I realized, with painful clarity, that a house is just wood, glass, and brick. True security is having zero debt and a fat savings account. I called a highly trusted, discreet colleague at my brokerage and asked her to quietly list my house as a pocket listing. This meant it would not hit the public internet market, avoiding neighborhood gossip, but she could show it exclusively to highly motivated, pre-qualified buyers. While I was agonizing over my financial survival in silence, my family was dealing with a self-inflicted crisis of their own. Nolan had finally pushed his long-suffering landlord too far. After 6 months of consistently late payments, multiple police visits for noise complaints from his raging weeknight parties, and a blatant, arrogant disregard for the building's rules, he was formally served with an eviction notice. He was 30 years old, unemployed again after quitting a lucrative marketing gig because his boss dared to ask for a status report, and he was staring down the barrel of impending homelessness. I heard about this disaster through my mother. She called me on a Thursday evening, crying hysterically into the phone about how incredibly unfair the world was to her youngest boy. She complained that the housing market was rigged, that landlords were predatory monsters, and that Nolan was just going through a rough patch. Then, she dropped a line that I brushed off in my exhausted state at the time, but would later haunt me. "We really need to lean on each other right now, Bradley," she said, sniffing loudly. "Family is all we have in this cruel world. We all have to make sacrifices to protect our own. You understand that, right?" I agreed mechanically, staring blankly at my laptop screen, assuming she was just asking for generic emotional support or perhaps leading up to asking me for a small loan. I was so deeply drowning in the logistics of my own impending real estate transaction, so consumed by the grief of losing my home, that I did not see the massive trap being set right beneath my feet. I did not realize that while I was fighting a war to save my financial future, my own flesh and blood had identified me as the perfect, convenient sacrificial lamb to solve Nolan's self-inflicted disaster. The ultimate betrayal was brewing, orchestrated not by strangers, but by the people who were supposed to protect me. The pocket listing strategy worked faster and more efficiently than I could have ever imagined in my wildest dreams. Just 2 days after making the agonizing decision to sell my sanctuary, my colleague called me. She brought over Oliver and Fiona Harding, a young, professional, dual-income couple who had just lost a brutal, heartbreaking bidding war on a very similar property 2 streets over. I left the house so they could tour it in peace. My colleague later told me their eyes lit up the second they walked through the front door, captivated by the original woodwork and the massive oak tree in the front yard. Fiona was 6 months pregnant, and they were utterly desperate to secure a safe, beautiful home before the baby arrived. By 8 o'clock that exact same night, my phone rang. My colleague sounded breathless. The Hardings had offered 10% over my original, ambitious asking price. It was an all-cash offer, completely waiving the inspection contingency and the appraisal contingency. The only catch, the singular condition, was that their current lease was ending, and they needed to close the transaction in exactly 30 days. However, knowing my delicate situation, they generously agreed to a rent-back clause, a legal agreement allowing me to stay in the house for an additional 30 days after closing for a nominal fee so I could find a new apartment and pack my life away without rushing. It was an absolute miracle. The sheer amount of equity I was walking away with was staggering. It would not only completely wipe out my suffocating debts, but also leave me with a massive, 6-figure safety net in my bank account. I sat at my kitchen island, staring at the digital contract on my laptop, and signed the preliminary acceptance paperwork with shaking hands. A massive, physical weight lifted off my chest, so heavy I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in months. I was losing my dream home, yes, but I was gaining my ultimate freedom. I was taking my life back. I made a conscious, deliberate decision to tell absolutely no one in my family about the sale. The transaction was moving at lightning speed, but anyone in the real estate business knows that deals can fall apart at the 11th hour over the smallest technicality. More importantly, I simply did not have the emotional bandwidth to deal with my mother's dramatic, performative gasps or my father's unsolicited, outdated financial advice. I wanted this victory, this painful but necessary transition, to be mine alone. But as the closing date rapidly approached, the atmosphere radiating from my family grew incredibly bizarre and unsettling. It started with a sudden, uncharacteristic influx of phone calls. My father, who usually only texted me to complain about the Chicago Bears or ask if I had watched a specific golf tournament, called me 3 times in one single week. Every conversation was strangely vague and awkwardly probing. He would ask about my current work schedule, how many hours I was at the office, how often I traveled out of state for clients, and then he would abruptly end the call with, "We have some very important family matters to discuss this Sunday. Make sure you are on time for dinner. Do not be late, Bradley." Then came the texts from Nolan, my brother, who typically only ever reached out when he needed to borrow my truck to move a couch or ask for $50, suddenly became intensely, deeply interested in the mundane logistics of my house. "Hey bro," he texted on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in a meeting. "What internet provider do you use out there? Is the upload speed good enough for heavy online gaming and streaming?" I frowned at my phone screen under the conference table, replying that I had gigabit fiber, and asking why on earth he cared about my internet speed. "Just curious," he replied instantly, appending a smiley face emoji. "Hey, what are the exact dimensions of your home office? Could a queen-sized bed fit in there comfortably without blocking the closet?" Loud alarm bells started ringing in my head, echoing in the silence of my realization. My home office was strictly for work. It held my heavy oak desk, my filing cabinets, and my client records. I told him a bed would definitely not fit well and quickly changed the subject, telling him I had to get back to work. I tried to brush it off as Nolan just being his usual weird, boundaryless self. But the final, devastating piece of the puzzle snapped into place on Thursday afternoon, just 2 days before I was scheduled to go to the title company and sign the final closing documents. I bumped into Marcus at a crowded coffee shop downtown. Marcus was an old buddy from college, a guy who unfortunately still hung out with Nolan occasionally to watch football. "Hey man, sorry to hear about your new roommate situation," Marcus said casually, taking a sip of his iced Americano. "But good on you for stepping up and helping Nolan out. He told me last night over beers that he is moving into your spare room next week." I froze. The background noise of the coffee shop, the grinding espresso machines, the chatter of the crowd, faded into a low, static hum. My blood ran completely cold. "Excuse me? Moving into my house? What are you talking about, Marcus?" "Yeah." Marcus looked confused, his smile dropping as he saw the genuine shock on my face. "He said your parents worked it all out with you. He even showed me a floor plan he sketched out on a bar napkin. He was bragging all night about how he is going to completely take over your home office because it has the best natural light for his gaming setup. Did he not actually tell you?" A cold, hard, terrifying clarity washed over me, starting from my chest and spreading to my fingertips. The strange, probing phone calls from my father. The weirdly specific texts about the internet speed and room dimensions from Nolan. My mother's tearful, manipulative speech about family sacrifices and protecting our own. They were not just asking for a favor. They had held a literal council without me, negotiated the use of my private living space, and unilaterally decided that my hard-earned home was the perfect, rent-free housing solution for their golden child. They fully intended to ambush me at the upcoming Sunday dinner. I could see the entire playbook in my head. They were going to corner me in front of the food and the expensive champagne, using overwhelming guilt, emotional manipulation, and the pressure of family obligation to force me into compliance. They assumed I would just cave and say yes because I had always been the responsible one. I had always been the one to absorb the impact of Nolan's failures so the family could keep pretending everything was fine. I thanked Marcus, my voice sounding distant to my own ears, walked out of the coffee shop, got into my car, and sat behind the wheel for a long time. I did not feel angry. The time for anger had passed years ago. I felt an icy, terrifying, absolute calm. I realized in that profound moment that my family did not view me as a son, or a brother, or even a person with my own life. They viewed me as a resource, an asset to be managed and drained for Nolan's benefit. The next afternoon, Friday, the sky was bright and clear. I walked into the sleek, modern office of the title company. Oliver and Fiona Harding were already there, sitting on a leather sofa, practically vibrating with joy and excitement. I sat at the long, polished mahogany conference table, picked up the heavy black pen the escrow officer handed me, and signed my name 20 different times. The notary stamped the documents with a heavy thud. The wire transfer was confirmed by the bank. The deed was officially legally transferred. I handed over a spare set of house keys to Oliver, shook his hand, congratulated the glowing young couple on their beautiful new home, and walked out of the building. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, my banking app chimed with a notification on my phone. I logged in and stared at the screen. A massive, six-figure cash balance stared back at me. I was entirely 100% debt-free. Furthermore, I had already signed a lease for a sleek, low-maintenance industrial loft downtown starting in 3 weeks. My life was completely bulletproof. I was untouchable. I drove back to the house that was no longer legally mine, walked into the kitchen, looked at the calendar hanging on the wall, and took a red marker to circle Sunday. They thought they were walking into a dinner to execute a master manipulation. They thought they had outsmarted me, that they were going to back me into a corner I could not escape. They had no idea they were walking straight into a slaughter. I packed the thick stack of closing documents into a manila envelope, slid them securely into my briefcase, and waited for the storm to hit. The drive to my parents' house that fateful Sunday evening felt like a surreal journey into a completely different dimension. The sky over the sprawling Chicago suburbs was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a massive late summer thunderstorm. My tires hummed against the familiar asphalt of the streets I had grown up on. Every single house I passed looked exactly the same as it did 20 years ago. There were the perfectly manicured lawns, the massive two-car garages, the basketball hoops standing like sentinels in the driveways, and the overly aggressive neighborhood watch signs. It was a picture of absolute suburban perfection, a carefully constructed, expensive facade that expertly hid whatever deep dysfunction was brewing behind those heavy oak front doors. For years, my entire life had revolved around craving the approval of the people living in one of those houses. I had desperately wanted a seat at the table where I was respected as an equal, not just tolerated as the reliable workhorse who could fix their tech issues or spot them a few $100. But today, with the heavy manila envelope resting quietly on the passenger seat next to me, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical, and calculating detachment. I pulled my car into their wide, freshly paved driveway at exactly 5 o'clock. I was not a minute early, and I was not a minute late. I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, locked my car, and walked up the pristine concrete path. Before my finger even hovered over the glowing doorbell, I could hear the faint, sophisticated sound of my mother's favorite vintage jazz record playing inside. It was a total setup. Everything was meticulously curated to create a false sense of warmth, nostalgia, and unbreakable security. My father, Richard, opened the door before I even rang the bell. Richard was a man who believed deeply in the appearance of success and the ironclad hierarchy of the traditional family. He wore a crisp, expensive navy polo shirt and imported Italian loafers, greeting me with a hearty, overly enthusiastic clap on the shoulder that felt entirely rehearsed. His grip was just a little too tight, his smile just a little too wide. He ushered me into the formal living room, where the air was thick with the rich, savory smell of roasted beef, heavy garlic, and fresh rosemary. My mother, Brenda, immediately emerged from the kitchen. She was wearing a floral apron over a very nice Sunday dress, wiping her hands on a pristine white dish towel. She rushed over and pulled me into a hug that lasted a fraction of a second too long, her eyes darting around my face as if she were desperately searching for a weakness, checking my mood to see if I was pliable. She ushered me into the formal dining room, and that is exactly when I saw the physical setup of the trap. She had brought out the good china, the plates with the delicate gold trim, the heavy, polished silver cutlery. The vintage, incredibly expensive champagne was chilling in a silver bucket resting on the mahogany sideboard. It was a theatrical production, and I was the unsuspecting audience member they fully planned to drag onto the stage and sacrifice. We made polite, agonizing small talk for 25 minutes while we waited for the guest of honor to arrive. My father sat back in his recliner, swirling a glass of scotch, and started asking incredibly generic but probing questions about the real estate market. He aggressively inquired about my commission structures, asking if the recent changes in interest rates were going to affect my salary prospects for the upcoming quarter. He asked if I was putting enough away into a 401k, masking his interrogation as paternal concern. I gave him vague, non-committal answers, watching his eyes narrow as he mentally calculated my net worth. He transitioned into a long, boring lecture about how important it was to build a solid portfolio, how the modern economy was brutally punishing those who did not have a family safety net, and how a family's greatest, most untouchable asset was its total unity. Every single word out of his mouth was a carefully planted seed for the ambush that was about to happen. Then, the front door swung open with a loud bang, and Nolan made his grand entrance. He did not apologize for being late. He did not offer a reason. He strolled right into the house wearing a crisp button-down shirt that looked like it had just been taken out of the retail packaging that morning, completely ditching his usual ripped jeans and faded band tees. He was carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost less than a gallon of premium gas, holding it by the neck like it was a grand offering. My parents immediately flocked to him like he was a returning war hero. My mother rushed to take his coat, praising how incredibly handsome and professional he looked. My father took the cheap wine as if Nolan had just handed him the deed to a new property, clapping him on the back. We moved into the dining room and took our seats at the table. They directed Nolan to sit at the absolute head of the table, a position of power my father had never surrendered to me in my entire adult life. I took my usual spot on the side, quietly observing this masterclass in psychological manipulation unfolding in front of me. As we passed the heavy ceramic serving dishes full of mashed potatoes and green beans, the tone of the conversation drastically shifted. It was no longer about general economics or sports. It became a targeted, laser-focused, and highly coordinated interrogation of my lifestyle and my assets. My mother cut a small piece of potato, chewed it delicately, and looked at me across the table with an expression of profound, completely manufactured concern. She started talking about my house. She kept saying how massive and overwhelming it must feel when the sun goes down and the rooms get dark. She used words like echoing, empty, isolated, and burdensome. She asked me, her voice dripping with fake sympathy, how many times a week I actually walked into the spare bedrooms. She asked if I ever felt anxious living completely alone in such a large property, entirely ignoring the absolute fact that I had lived there safely and happily for 2 solid years. Nolan chimed in, chewing loudly with his mouth open, his eyes gleaming with a greedy, entitled light. He started talking about his own disastrous living situation, expertly painting himself as the tragic, helpless victim of a ruthless, predatory corporate landlord. He completely omitted the part where he threw raging, drug-fueled house parties on Tuesday nights. He left out the fact that he blatantly ignored every single HOA regulation in the building. He conveniently forgot to mention that he simply refused to pay his rent on time because he wanted to buy a new gaming computer. Instead, he spun a heartbreaking narrative where he was a hard-working, deeply misunderstood creative genius being forced out onto the freezing streets by sheer corporate greed and a rigged system. My father nodded along solemnly, tapping his silver fork against his expensive china plate. He launched into a heavy, suffocating monologue about family duty and moral obligation. He looked directly into my eyes and stated that true wealth is not real estate, a massive stock portfolio, or a high salary. True wealth, according to Richard, was the people who have your back when the entire world turns against you. He said that a brother's bond is a sacred, unbreakable contract, and that in times of desperate crisis, the strong must provide shelter and resources for the weak. It was a beautiful cinematic speech, completely and utterly devoid of reality. They were laying the moral groundwork right there over the pot roast, building a suffocating cage of guilt and obligation around me so tight that when they finally sprang the trap, they believed I would not be able to breathe, let alone summon the courage to say no. I just sat there, cutting my meat, eating my dinner, and nodding politely. I did not argue with a single point. I did not defend my house or my independence. I simply let them dig their hole deeper and deeper and deeper. I watched my mother pour the rich brown gravy, watched my father casually check his expensive watch, and watched Nolan literally vibrate with entitled anticipation in his chair. They were so unbelievably confident in their master plan. They genuinely believed that because I had always played by the rules, because I had always paid my own way, and because I had always desperately sought their validation, I would simply bow my head, absorb the financial and emotional damage, and hand over the keys to my kingdom. The dinner plates were finally cleared away. My mother walked proudly out of the kitchen and brought out a massive, steaming homemade apple pie, setting it gently in the exact center of the table. The air in the room shifted instantly. The casual banter died down, replaced by a thick, heavy, electric anticipation. This was it, the climax of their little play, the moment of execution. My father looked down the table and gave a sharp, subtle nod to Nolan, a silent cue that it was time to execute the final maneuver and claim the prize. Nolan stood up from the head of the table. He smoothed down the front of his new shirt, acting exactly like a CEO about to announce a major, incredibly lucrative corporate merger. He reached out for the silver ice bucket, pulled out the dripping bottle of vintage champagne, and gripped the cork. The loud crack echoed off the walls of the quiet dining room. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into the 4 crystal flutes my mother had eagerly set out an hour prior. He handed a glass to my mother, slid one over to my father, and finally, he pushed the last crystal flute across the polished mahogany wood directly toward me. Nolan raised his glass. The smug, incredibly self-satisfied grin on his face is an image that is permanently burned into my retinas. He was not asking for a brotherly favor. He was claiming a prize he believed he was owed simply by existing. He looked around the table, soaking in the adoring, proud gazes of our enabling parents, and then he locked his eyes completely on me. The trap was officially sprung, the jaws were snapping shut, and he was ready to sit back and watch me squirm in the cage they had built. As you all know, I have been dealing with a completely toxic, unfair housing situation. Nolan began, projecting his voice across the dining room, dripping with a sickeningly fake humility. My landlord is an absolute tyrant, and the rental market in this city right now is just impossible for someone like me who is trying to build a career from the ground up. I was really stressed, losing sleep about where I was going to go when the lease was up. He took a dramatic, theatrical pause, swirling the expensive golden champagne in his crystal glass. My parents beamed at him from across the table, practically vibrating with pride and anticipation. But every dark cloud has a silver lining, Nolan continued, his grin widening into a massive, triumphant smirk. Mom and Dad and I have been talking all week. We looked at all the logistics, we ran all the options, and we came up with the absolute perfect win-win solution for everyone involved. Starting next Saturday, I am moving into your house, Bradley. Just until I get back on my feet, obviously. Mom pointed out that your home office has the absolute best natural light for my streaming setup, so I will be taking that room and moving your desk out. And hey, I can even help you mow the lawn once in a while to cover my share of the utilities and groceries. He raised his glass higher, the light catching the bubbles. To family, to sticking together when things get tough. My father proudly raised his glass in the air. My mother raised hers, actual tears of joy welling in her eyes, moved by this beautiful display of forced sibling unity. To family, they echoed in perfect unison. They all turned their heads to look directly at me, waiting for me to raise my glass, waiting for my absolute submission. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10 seconds. The triumphant, glowing smiles on their faces began to twitch, just slightly, as the quiet, heavy rejection hung in the air like a thick fog. I did not touch my champagne glass. I did not even look at it. I calmly leaned over, reached down to the floor, picked up my heavy leather briefcase, and placed it directly onto the center of the dining room table, right next to my mother's homemade apple pie. I grabbed the zipper and pulled it open, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the thick, uncomfortable silence like a serrated knife. I reached inside, pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope, flipped the metal clasp open, and extracted the freshly signed HUD-1 settlement statement, the escrow instructions, and the notarized copy of the deed transfer. I placed my hand flat on top of the heavy stack of legal documents and slid them across the polished mahogany table until they bumped gently against the base of Nolan's crystal flute. "That is a very creative, highly detailed plan, Nolan," I said, my voice completely level, completely devoid of any anger, malice, or fear. "There is just one massive, insurmountable logistical flaw." My mother lowered her glass slowly, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What do you mean, Bradley? What are those papers you just put on the table?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest, looking her dead in the eye. "I sold the house. I signed the final, binding closing documents yesterday afternoon at the title company. The buyer's wire transfer has already cleared my bank account. The new owners, an incredibly lovely young couple who are expecting a baby, take full legal possession of the property in exactly 30 days. I am currently just a tenant, renting the house back from them for 1 month while I pack my boxes. So, unless you plan on breaking and entering into a total stranger's private property and catching a felony charge, you will not be moving into my spare bedroom, or my home office, or anywhere near that house." The reaction was instantaneous, visceral, and absolute. It was as if I had detonated a live grenade in the middle of their perfect suburban dining room. My mother gasped, a sharp, ragged, incredibly loud intake of breath. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching her pearls as if she were having a literal, physical heart attack. The crystal champagne flute slipped entirely from her trembling fingers, tipping over and spilling bubbling golden liquid all over her pristine white linen tablecloth, soaking into the fabric. My father's face went from a healthy, relaxed pink to a dangerous, mottled, furious purple in a matter of seconds. He snatched the thick stack of papers off the table, aggressively shoving his reading glasses onto his nose. His eyes frantically darted across the pages, scanning the complex legal jargon, the bolded notary stamps, the escrow numbers, and the finalized signatures. He was desperately looking for a loophole, a missing signature, a mistake, a reason to call me a liar. Nolan just froze. The smug, arrogant, entitled grin completely melted off his face like wax near a flame, replaced by a look of profound, uncomprehending shock and sheer terror. His jaw physically dropped open. He stared at the documents shaking in my father's hands, and then he slowly turned his head to stare at me, his eyes wide with a chaotic mixture of intense betrayal and rapidly rising panic. You sold it?" Nolan stammered, his voice cracking, completely losing his confident CEO persona. "Without telling anyone? Without consulting the family? Are you totally insane? I did not realize I needed to schedule a board meeting and consult the family directors to liquidate my own personal real estate asset," I replied coldly, leaning forward. "The main plumbing line failed. The repairs were going to cost over $7,000 that I simply did not have in cash. I was house poor, drowning in high-interest debt, and facing potential financial ruin. I met with my financial advisor, we ran the hard numbers, and I made a strategic, adult decision to sell the property at the absolute top of the market. Because I sold, I am completely debt-free as of this morning. It was the smartest financial move of my entire life." "You did this on purpose," Nolan suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs, slamming his fists down onto the table so hard the china plates rattled and the silverware jumped. His face was contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. "You found out from Marcus that I needed a place to stay, and you maliciously sold your house just to spite me. You would rather sell your own home to strangers than help your own brother keep a roof over his head. Do not flatter yourself, Nolan." I shot back, the icy calm I had maintained finally cracking just a fraction to let the venom seep through. "The universe does not revolve around you. I do not make massive real estate transactions based on your inability to pay rent. I sold my house to save my own financial life and secure my future. The fact that my decision completely torpedoed your secret, entitled plan to leech off my hard work for the next 5 years is just a very fortunate, hilarious coincidence." My father slammed the legal documents down onto the wet tablecloth. "Bradley, This is completely unacceptable behavior. This is a finalized real estate contract, yes, but there must be a way out. You need to call your real estate lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. You need to tell the buyers you made a massive mistake. Give them their earnest money back, offer them a penalty fee, pay whatever it takes to break the contract. You cannot leave your own flesh and blood out on the street. I stared at the man who had raised me, utterly disgusted by his blatant, delusional disregard for reality and the law. Are you out of your mind? You want me to intentionally breach a legally binding contract, invite a massive, crippling civil lawsuit that would instantly strip me of my real estate license, bankrupt me, and destroy my entire professional career, just so Nolan can have a free room to play video games in? The answer is no. Absolutely, unequivocally not. We will help you with the plumbing costs, my mother cried out, tears streaming down her face, desperately grasping at straws, trying to put the broken pieces of her plan back together. We will write you a check for the $7,000 right now. Just keep the house, Bradley, please. We will make it work. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, looking down at the three of them. The years of deep resentment, the decades of blatant double standards, the absolute exhaustion of being the unloved workhorse, finally boiled over and erupted. You will pay the $7,000? I asked, my voice rising, vibrating with righteous, decades-old anger. Where the hell was that money when I was 18 years old, working the midnight graveyard shift at a greasy diner, scrubbing toilets to pay for my college textbooks, while you handed Nolan a full ride to a university he completely flunked out of? Where was that massive family safety net when I was drowning in student loans, eating ramen noodles, while you gladly paid off Nolan's credit cards so he could fly to music festivals? You bought him a brand new car when he wrecked his. You paid his rent when he got fired for incompetence. You enabled his complete lack of responsibility for 10 solid years, and now you want to buy my house so he has a place to rot. We were trying to protect him. My mother sobbed loudly, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. He is sensitive. He struggles in this world in ways you do not understand. You have always been so capable. You did not protect him. I fired back, pointing a sharp finger directly at Nolan, who was shrinking back in his chair, suddenly terrified of the monster he had awoken. You crippled him. You completely destroyed his ability to function as an adult. You turned him into a 30-year-old child who honestly thinks he can unilaterally demand the keys to a house I bled for 8 years to buy. I built my entire life from the ground up with zero financial help, zero college funds, and zero inheritance from this family. My house, my rules, my money. You wanted to make a unilateral decision about my property? Well, I made a unilateral decision about my future. The bank wire has cleared. I am moving into a one-bedroom apartment downtown next month. There is no spare bedroom. There is no home office. There is no free ride anymore. I grabbed the manila envelope off the table, shoving the wet papers back into my briefcase, and zipped it shut with an aggressive, final motion. I am completely, permanently done being the backup plan and the ATM for Nolan's failures, I said, looking my father dead in his furious eyes. If you want to keep enabling him, that is your choice as parents. Let him move into your house. Give him your spare bedroom. Let him drain your bank accounts and ruin your retirement. But my doors are permanently closed. I turned my back on the chaotic, screaming, crying mess in the dining room and walked out the front door without looking back. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me. The cool, damp night air hit my face, and as I walked down the driveway to my car, for the first time in my entire adult life, I felt completely, utterly, and beautifully free. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The immediate fallout from the dining room massacre was relentless, incredibly toxic, and entirely predictable. By the time I woke up the next morning in my quiet house, my phone had turned into a glowing, constantly vibrating brick of digital harassment. I had 14 missed calls from my mother, leaving voicemails where she was hyperventilating and begging me to reconsider. I had 5 furious voicemails from my father, his voice booming through the speaker, demanding I answer the phone, act like a man, and fix the disaster I had supposedly created. My text inbox was a barrage of unhinged, rapidly escalating messages from Nolan, alternating between furious insults and pathetic begging. But the most exhausting part was the flying monkeys. My family, realizing they had lost their grip on me, immediately deployed their vast network of enablers to try and shame me into submission. Aunt Sylvia, my mother's older sister who lived entirely on her ex-husband's alimony and thrived on neighborhood gossip, left a venomous, 5-minute voicemail. "Bradley, I cannot believe what your mother just told me," Aunt Sylvia screeched through the phone, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You are a cold-blooded monster. You are a complete disgrace to this family name. To throw your own flesh and blood out onto the freezing streets over a few dollars? You mark my words, Bradley, you keep this up, and you will be completely written out of the inheritance. Do not expect an invitation to Thanksgiving, and do not expect me to show up at your funeral. You will end up completely alone with your money." I did not respond to her. I did not justify my actions. I simply engaged the block function on my phone, permanently deleting her number from my life. The threat of losing a non-existent inheritance or missing a miserable family holiday honestly sounded like a luxury vacation to me. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and went about my day, packing boxes. I was in the middle of packing my living room exactly 3 days later. Cardboard boxes were stacked waist-high against the freshly painted walls. I was carefully wrapping my expensive glassware in bubble wrap when a loud, aggressive, frantic pounding echoed from my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was someone desperately trying to break the door down. I walked over and looked through the brass peephole. It was Nolan. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, keeping my foot firmly planted behind the heavy wood so he could not force his way inside. He looked absolutely terrible. His eyes were bloodshot and frantic. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and he reeked of stale beer, cheap cigarettes, and absolute desperation. The smug, entitled arrogance from Sunday night was completely gone, entirely replaced by a feral, cornered panic. "What do you want, Nolan?" I asked, my voice flat, showing zero emotion. He pushed against the door, ignoring my boundary, and stood on the threshold, staring past my shoulder at the fortress of brown moving boxes filling the living room. The reality of my real estate sale was finally, painfully sinking into his thick skull. "You really did it," he muttered, his voice trembling, kicking a stray piece of packing tape on the porch. "You actually threw it all away. You really sold it." "I secured my financial future," I corrected him sharply. "You have exactly 2 minutes to tell me why you are trespassing on a property that I am busy packing before I close this door in your face." Nolan spun around, his hands held up in a pleading gesture. "Brad, please, you have to help me. I am begging you. My landlord locked the doors to the building this morning. He literally changed the deadbolts on my apartment while I was out getting coffee. My stuff is sitting in black garbage bags on the curb. I have nowhere to go. My friends will not take me in because their places are too small, and Mom and Dad are absolutely furious with me right now because of the blowout at dinner. They told me I need to figure it out myself." That sounds like a very severe, very real consequence to a long series of terrible choices, I said, leaning casually against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. "It is not my problem to solve." "But you walked away with a massive pile of cash from this sale," Nolan yelled, his deeply ingrained sense of entitlement flaring up through his panic. "I know how the market is. I know how much equity you had built up. You are sitting on an absolute gold mine right now. I just need a loan. 5 grand, 10 grand, max. Just enough for a security deposit, first, and last month's rent on a decent luxury apartment downtown so I can get back on my feet. I will pay you back every single cent as soon as I get a new job. I swear on my life." I actually laughed. It was a cold, bitter, hollow sound that echoed on the porch. Alone? You mean a gift that I will never, ever see again. You want a massive cut of my hard-earned real estate money to fund a luxury apartment lease you cannot possibly afford, while you do not even have a source of income to pay the second month's rent. Absolutely not. I am your brother, he screamed, his face turning bright red, spit flying from his lips. You are just going to let your own blood be homeless? You are not going to be homeless, Nolan, I said, maintaining my icy, unbreakable calm. You have plenty of real-world options. You can go on Craigslist right now, today, and rent a single bedroom in a shared house with 4 other guys for $500 a month. You can swallow your massive pride, drive back to the suburbs, and beg mom and dad to let you sleep on the couch in their basement. You can walk down the street and get a job waiting tables tonight to generate immediate cash flow. Those are your options. Reaching your hand into my bank account is not one of them. He stared at me, his fists clenched tight at his sides, his chest heaving, finally realizing that the family ATM was permanently, irrevocably closed. He spat a curse at my feet, turned around, and stormed down the driveway, screaming at the top of his lungs that I was dead to him and that he would never forgive me. I calmly shut the door, locked the deadbolt, and went back to packing my glassware. I felt a slight, fleeting twinge of guilt, conditioned by 30 years of intense family programming, but it was quickly overshadowed and destroyed by a massive, overwhelming wave of profound relief. 2 weeks later, moving day officially arrived. The professional movers I hired cleared out the entire house in under 4 hours. I walked through the empty rooms one last time. The echoes of my footsteps were loud, bouncing off the original hardwood floors. I stood by the beautiful bay window in the living room, remembering the sheer panic of the plumbing disaster, the crushing weight of the mortgage payments, and the devastating betrayal of my family's plot. I took a deep, cleansing breath, walked out the front door, and locked it for the final time. I met Oliver and Fiona Harding at the title company an hour later to hand over the physical keys. Fiona was glowing, gently holding her pregnant belly, actual tears of joy in her eyes. Oliver shook my hand vigorously, thanking me profusely for leaving the house in such immaculate condition. Seeing the pure, unadulterated happiness on their faces validated every single painful decision I had made. The house was no longer a financial prison for me. It was going to be a beautiful, safe sanctuary for a new family to raise their child. That night, I slept on an air mattress on the floor of my new industrial loft downtown. The space was sleek, modern, and a fraction of the size of my old house. The exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors meant absolutely no agonizing maintenance. No yard work on the weekends. No surprise $7,000 plumbing disasters. I looked at my banking app one more time before closing my eyes. I was completely debt-free, flush with cash, and completely untethered from the toxic, dragging anchor of my family's expectations. The true villain in my story was not just my brother. It was the deeply ingrained belief that I owed them my life, and that villain had been thoroughly, completely defeated. 6 months later, my life looked completely unrecognizable compared to the exhausted, terrified man who sat at that suburban dining table. The absolute financial freedom I gained from selling the house acted like high-octane rocket fuel for my career. Without the crushing, daily anxiety of impending bankruptcy and mortgage payments hanging over my head, I was able to operate with a clear, aggressive, and highly focused mind. I successfully negotiated and closed the massive commercial real estate deal for Victor, the incredibly demanding tech CEO. My commission check from that single transaction was astronomical, the absolute largest sum of money I had ever earned in my entire career. I took a massive chunk of that money and invested it straight into an aggressive retirement portfolio, maxed out my contributions, and used the rest to bolster my already substantial liquid savings account. I was absolutely thriving in my downtown loft. I joined a high-end gym, started taking weekend hiking trips to the mountains just because I could, and actually began dating again without the constant, humiliating stress of checking my credit card limits before ordering dinner. I had instituted a strict, unbreakable, low-contact boundary with my parents. I did not answer random phone calls. I communicated only via brief text messages for major holidays or absolute emergencies. But the most shocking, unbelievable transformation did not happen to me in the city. It happened back in the quiet suburbs. According to frequent updates from Carmen, who still occasionally heard the neighborhood gossip from our old college circles, Nolan had been forced to execute the exact, humiliating emergency plan I had laid out for him on my porch. With zero financial bailout coming from my direction, and my parents finally terrified of losing their only remaining, successful son to permanent estrangement, the family dynamic fundamentally shifted. Nolan had to swallow his pride and move back into my parents' house. But this time, the golden child treatment was abruptly, violently canceled. My father actually called me on a random Tuesday afternoon. I saw his name flash on my phone screen. I hesitated for a long time, my thumb hovering over the decline button, but I finally answered. He sounded exhausted, noticeably older, but strangely grounded and calm. "Bradley," he said, his voice lacking the usual booming, arrogant authority. "I just wanted to call and say, you were right, about everything, about us. Nolan has been living with us in the basement for 5 months. And how is the free ride going?" I asked, keeping my tone completely neutral, refusing to offer an inch of sympathy. "There is no free ride anymore." My father sighed heavily into the phone. "The first week he was here, he threw a party in the basement with his friends while we were asleep. He broke a window and stained the carpet. Your mother," she finally snapped. "We sat him down at the kitchen table. We demanded $500 a month in rent, mandatory weekly chores, and physical proof of job applications every single Friday. We told him to his face that if he missed a single payment, we would pack his bags in garbage bags ourselves and leave them on the curb." I was genuinely stunned. I sat down on my sofa, staring at the wall. "You actually enforced a boundary? You stood your ground." "We had to," he admitted, his voice thick with genuine regret. "Seeing you walk away from that house, seeing you pack your things and cut us off so easily, it woke us up. We realized we were loving him to death. We were destroying his life by constantly saving him from himself." The strict, unbreakable discipline, combined with the sudden, terrifying lack of a financial safety net, forced Nolan to finally face the brutal reality of the real world. He complained, he screamed, he threatened to run away, but he had absolutely nowhere else to go. The bank of mom and dad was closed, and his brother was gone. Eventually, the fundamental human hunger for independence overpowered his deep-seated laziness. He took a grueling entry-level marketing job at a mid-sized firm. He was working 50 hours a week, commuting on the crowded train, and actually paying his parents rent on time every single month. The ultimate, undeniable proof of this miracle came during Thanksgiving dinner. I agreed to attend, driving my new, fully paid-off car out to the suburbs with a very cautious heart and my boundaries firmly in place. The atmosphere in the house was completely different. There was no good china, no expensive vintage champagne, just a regular, slightly chaotic, normal family dinner. Nolan looked physically tired, the dark bags under his eyes a testament to actual, honest hard work. After dinner, while my parents were in the kitchen making coffee and slicing pie, Nolan cornered me in the living room. I immediately braced myself for a sarcastic comment, a demand for cash, or a passive-aggressive jab about my loft. Instead, he pulled out his smartphone and opened a financial banking app. "Hey, Brad," Nolan said, rubbing the back of his neck, looking genuinely embarrassed, refusing to make eye contact at first. "My company just offered me a 401k match program after my 90-day review. I have literally no idea what I am doing with this. Should I be looking at conservative index funds or like aggressive growth stocks? You know this financial stuff better than anyone. Can you look at this and help me set it up?" I stared at him for a long, silent moment. The sneering entitlement was completely gone. The golden child illusion had been shattered into pieces, and standing in its place was a 30-year-old man finally trying to learn how to walk on his own 2 feet. I sat down next to him on the couch, took his phone, and spent the next hour explaining the beauty of compound interest, employer matching, and long-term financial planning. It was the most authentic, real, and respectful conversation we had ever had in our entire lives. A year after the disastrous dinner that changed everything, I closed on a new property. It was not a sprawling, century-old craftsman with endless maintenance issues, a bad foundation, and a crippling mortgage. It was a sleek, modern, highly practical 3-bedroom townhouse in a fantastic, up-and-coming neighborhood. I put down a massive 50% down payment using the cash from my previous sale and my recent commercial real estate commissions. My monthly overhead was ridiculously low. I had a beautiful home office that belonged only to me, a manageable patio, and absolute, unshakable peace of mind. When I look back at the chaos, the bitter betrayal, and the profound heartbreak of that year, I realize that selling my dream house was not a defeat. It was the ultimate, defining victory of my life. I had to completely burn down the false kingdom I had built to realize that true wealth is not the square footage of your property, the prestigious address on your mailbox, or the approval of parents who only love you when you are useful to their agenda. True wealth is absolute financial security, ironclad personal boundaries, and the profound, quiet peace of knowing that nobody can ever manipulate you into sacrificing your own future. I lost a house, but I gained my life, and in the process, by ruthlessly cutting off the toxic supply of enabling, I inadvertently forced my family to hit rock bottom and finally heal. We are not a perfect family. We probably never will be. But the respect between us is real now, because it was forged in the hot fire of consequence and reality. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to walk away from something you truly loved to protect your own sanity, your financial future, and your life from the people closest to you? Share your story in the comments below. Do not let anyone ever convince you that protecting your peace makes you the villain of the story. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Stay strong, and keep your boundaries ironclad.